The mystery of Jack the Ripper. London in the late 1800s was a city of stark contrast. The wealthy lived in comfort while the poor struggled daily in overcrowded slums. Nowhere was this divide more apparent than in Whitechapel, a district in the East End known for its poverty, crime, and desperation. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with dilapidated buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. At night, the flickering gas lamps created more shadows than light, providing perfect cover for those who wished to move unseen. The air carried a mix of unpleasant odors, the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and the ever-present smoke from countless coal fires. It was in this environment, during the autumn of 1888, that one of history's most infamous killers began his reign of terror. The man who would become known as Jack the Ripper emerged from these shadows without warning. His true identity remains unknown to this day, adding to the enduring mystery surrounding the case. What we do know is that he targeted women, specifically those who worked as prostitutes to survive in the harsh economic conditions of the time. His methods were particularly brutal, displaying knowledge of human anatomy that both horrified and puzzled investigators. The killer seemed to move through the streets like a ghost, striking suddenly before disappearing again into the night. The first confirmed murder attributed to the Ripper occurred on August 31, 1888. The victim was Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman who had turned to prostitution after her marriage failed and she could find no other work. Her body was discovered in Bucks Row, now Durward Street, just before 4 o'clock in the morning by a carman on his way to work. The killing had been quick and efficient, with the murderer showing no hesitation in his brutal work. What shocked investigators most was the surgical precision of the wounds, suggesting the killer possessed some medical knowledge. The police initially hoped this would be an isolated incident, but they would soon be proven terribly wrong. Just 8 days later, on September 8th, another victim was found. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman with a tragic life story, was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her injuries were even more severe than those inflicted on Nichols, showing a clear escalation in violence. The killer had taken trophies from his victim, a behavior that would become part of his disturbing pattern. The small courtyard where Chapman was found became a site of morbid fascination, with crowds gathering to catch a glimpse of the crime scene despite police efforts to maintain order. As news of these murders spread, panic began to grip the Whitechapel area. Local newspapers, eager for sensational stories, printed increasingly dramatic accounts of the killings. The police found themselves under tremendous pressure to solve the case, but with few clues to work with and forensic science still in its infancy, their investigation moved slowly. The killer seemed to know the area intimately, choosing locations that provided quick escape routes and limited visibility. He struck at times when few reliable witnesses would be about, demonstrating careful planning in his selection of both victims and murder sites. The terror reached new heights on September 30th, when 2 more women were killed in what became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant, was found murdered in Dutfield's yard just before 1 o'clock in the morning. Unlike the previous victims, her injuries were less severe, leading some to speculate the killer had been interrupted. Just 45 minutes later and less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes became the Ripper's next victim in Mitre Square. The contrast between the 2 murders on the same night added to the growing confusion about the killer's methods and motives. The most brutal of all the killings occurred on November 9th, when Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in her small rented room at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims who were killed outdoors, Kelly was attacked in the relative privacy of her own home. The extent of the mutilations shocked even experienced police officers, with one reportedly fainting at the scene. This murder marked a significant departure from the killer's previous pattern and would be the last confirmed Ripper killing. During this period, the police and newspapers received numerous letters claiming to be from the killer. The most famous of these, the From Hell letter, arrived with a small box containing what appeared to be half of a human kidney. While some experts believe these communications were genuine, others argue they were hoaxes created by journalists or attention seekers. The uncertainty surrounding these letters only added to the growing mythology of Jack the Ripper. As suddenly as the killings began, they stopped. The lack of any clear resolution fueled endless speculation. Some theorized the killer had died or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes. Others believed he may have left the country or been committed to an asylum. The police investigation, hampered by the limitations of Victorian-era detective work, never identified a definitive suspect. Over time, hundreds of theories would emerge, pointing fingers at everyone from local butchers to members of the royal family, but none with conclusive evidence. The legacy of Jack the Ripper extends far beyond the 5 canonical victims. The case marked a turning point in how society viewed serial killers and how police conducted investigations. It exposed the terrible living conditions in London's slums and forced conversations about poverty and women's rights. The mystery has inspired countless books, films, and television shows, each offering their own interpretation of events. Modern forensic experts continue to examine the case, applying new technologies to old evidence in hopes of finally solving the mystery. What makes the Ripper case so enduring is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the complete absence of answers. In an age where we expect mysteries to be solved through science and technology, the idea that such horrific crimes could remain unsolved after more than a century is both fascinating and unsettling. The foggy streets of Victorian London may have concealed the killer's identity forever, ensuring that Jack the Ripper would remain history's most enigmatic murderer. The story continues to captivate because it represents the perfect unsolved mystery, one where we have just enough information to speculate endlessly, but not enough to reach any definitive conclusions. As long as people are fascinated by true crime and historical puzzles, the legend of Jack the Ripper will endure, his true identity perhaps lost to time but his crimes never forgotten. The victims, lives cut short by the Ripper's blade. The 5 women considered canonical victims of Jack the Ripper shared tragic similarities in their life circumstances. All were poor, struggling to survive in the harsh environment of London's East End, and all had turned to prostitution at various points as a means of subsistence. Their stories paint a bleak picture of Victorian England's underclass, where women with few options faced daily dangers just to secure food and shelter. Marion Nichols, the first confirmed victim, was born in 1845 and had been married with 5 children before her life spiraled into poverty. Her husband had divorced her due to her drinking problems, leaving her to fend for herself in the unforgiving streets of Whitechapel. On the night of August 31st, 1888, she was last seen trying to earn money for a bed in a common lodging house. Her body was discovered just hours later with horrific throat and abdominal wounds that would become the killer's signature. Annie Chapman, killed 8 days after Nichols, had been a respectable wife and mother before tuberculosis took her youngest child and alcoholism destroyed her marriage. By 1888, the 47-year-old was living in common lodging houses and selling flowers and matches when she couldn't earn enough through prostitution. Her murder showed increased brutality, with the killer removing organs and arranging her personal possessions neatly by her feet in a grotesque display. Elizabeth Stride's death during the double event of September 30th presents lingering questions. As a Swedish immigrant who spoke limited English, she had lived a transient life across Europe before settling in London. Some researchers believe her murder may have been interrupted, as her injuries were less extensive than other victims. The killer's subsequent attack on Catherine Eddowes that same night showed his determination to complete his gruesome work, with Eddowes suffering facial mutilations and organ removals. Mary Jane Kelly's murder on November 9th marked the most horrifying culmination of the killing spree. At about 25 years old, she was the youngest victim and the only one killed indoors. The destruction of her body was so complete that identification was only possible through personal effects. Her relative youth and the private nature of her murder have led to numerous theories about why she may have been specifically targeted. These women were more than just victims. They were individuals with complex lives, dreams, and relationships. The sensational focus on their deaths often overshadows their humanity. Polly Nichols had been known for her cheerful nature despite her circumstances. Annie Chapman was described as quiet and well-liked by neighbors. Elizabeth Stride had survived a shipwreck earlier in life. Catherine Eddowes maintained relationships with family members who genuinely cared for her. Mary Jane Kelly was reportedly planning to leave prostitution and start anew. The Ripper's choice of victims reveals much about Victorian society's vulnerabilities. These women moved through shadowy areas of the city where their disappearances wouldn't immediately alarm authorities. Their lifestyles made them easy targets for someone preying on society's marginalized members. Yet their murders forced London to confront the terrible conditions that drove women to such desperate existences. In death, these 5 women became unwilling symbols of both the dangers faced by the poor and the limitations of law enforcement to protect them. Their stories remind us that behind the sensationalized legend of Jack the Ripper lie real human tragedies, not just in their violent ends, but in the difficult lives that made them vulnerable in the first place. The true horror extends beyond the murders themselves to the societal failures that allowed such crimes to occur and remain unsolved. The investigation, police efforts, and obstacles. The Whitechapel murders presented unprecedented challenges for London's Metropolitan Police and the separate City of London Police Force. Victorian detective methods, still in their relative infancy, proved woefully inadequate against a killer who left minimal evidence and operated with chilling efficiency. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional issues, public hysteria, and the limitations of forensic science in the 1880s. When the first murders occurred, the police initially treated them as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. This approach changed after Annie Chapman's murder, when similarities to Mary and Nichols' killing became impossible to ignore. Scotland Yard assigned Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, familiar with Whitechapel's criminal underworld, to lead the investigation. His team conducted hundreds of interviews and followed numerous leads, but each promising avenue eventually led to dead ends. The crime scenes themselves offered little useful evidence. Without modern forensic techniques like fingerprinting or blood analysis, detectives relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, most of which proved unreliable. The foggy, gaslit streets of Whitechapel made positive identifications nearly impossible, and many potential witnesses were hesitant to come forward, either from fear of the killer or distrust of police. One significant obstacle was the sheer volume of false confessions and misleading tips. The sensational newspaper coverage inspired countless attention seekers to claim responsibility or offer dubious information. Officers wasted valuable time pursuing leads from psychic visions, drunken boasts, and outright hoaxes. Even more serious suspects, like the notorious Leather Apron, a local oddjobber who intimidated prostitutes, were eventually cleared of involvement. The police conducted several innovative efforts for their time. They photographed crime scene evidence, surveyed local slaughterhouses for suspects with anatomical knowledge, and even consulted physicians about the killer's possible medical training. Some officers went undercover as potential targets, walking the streets at night in hopes of drawing out the murderer. These attempts showed remarkable dedication but ultimately failed to produce results. Perhaps the investigation's greatest weakness was the lack of coordination between police divisions. The Metropolitan Police and City Police operated independently, sometimes withholding information from each other due to institutional rivalry. This bureaucratic inefficiency may have allowed crucial connections between crimes to be overlooked in the investigation's early stages. As public pressure mounted, the Home Office offered a pardon to any accomplice who would come forward with information, an unprecedented move that yielded nothing. The police commissioner eventually resigned amid criticism of his handling of the case. By the time the killings stopped, the investigation had involved over 2,000 interviews, 300 suspects, and 80 detained individuals, yet no conclusive evidence against any single perpetrator. The Ripper case exposed fundamental flaws in Victorian law enforcement. It prompted reforms in police communication, forensic documentation, and investigative techniques that would shape modern detective work. While the Metropolitan Police were widely criticized at the time, modern analysts recognized they were simply unequipped to handle such an unusual criminal. The killer's ability to evade capture spoke less to police incompetence than to his understanding of the era's investigative limitations and the dark corners of a society that allowed his crimes to go unpunished. The letters, taunting clues or cruel hoaxes. During the investigation into the Whitechapel murders, the police and newspapers received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. These communications varied greatly in tone and content, ranging from rambling nonsense to disturbingly specific accounts of the crimes. The most famous of these, the Dear Boss letter dated September 25, 1888, first used the name Jack the Ripper and threatened further violence. This name would become forever associated with the case, regardless of whether the letter was genuine or not. The handwriting in these letters showed significant variation, suggesting multiple authors. Some contained details about the murders that had not been made public, while others clearly copied information already printed in newspapers. Police handwriting experts of the time lacked modern analytical techniques and could not definitively determine if any letters came from the actual killer. Many showed signs of being written by educated individuals, contradicting early theories that the murderer was an uneducated local. The From Hell letter, postmarked October 15, 1888, stood out for its particularly disturbing content. Accompanying the letter was a small box said to contain half of a human kidney preserved in wine. Medical examination suggested it might have come from Catherine Eddowes, whose body had shown evidence of a kidney removal. However, even this potentially crucial piece of evidence proved inconclusive, as the kidney could have been obtained from medical specimens available to students or doctors. Newspapers of the time played a complicated role in the letter phenomenon. Eager for sensational content, some publications printed full transcripts of the most dramatic letters, potentially inspiring copycats. This media frenzy created a feedback loop where each new letter received extensive coverage, encouraging more hoaxers to participate. Police complained that valuable investigative time was wasted chasing false leads generated by these publicity seekers. Modern forensic analysis has cast doubt on nearly all the Ripper letters. Linguistic examination reveals that several show similarities to newspaper phrasing of the time, suggesting they were composed by journalists or readers familiar with press coverage. The few letters that contained potentially authentic details could have been written by someone with access to police information rather than the killer himself. The lasting impact of these letters extends beyond their questionable authenticity. They shaped public perception of the killer as someone intelligent, mocking, and aware of his growing notoriety. This image of a taunting, media-savvy murderer would influence how future serial killers communicated with authorities and the press. The letters also demonstrated how quickly myth could blend with fact in high-profile criminal cases, a phenomenon that continues in modern true crime reporting. Despite numerous analyses over the decades, no consensus exists about whether any authentic Ripper letters were received. They remain historical curiosities that tell us more about Victorian media culture and public fascination with crime than about the killer's true identity. The very existence of so many fake letters speaks to the extraordinary hold the case had on the public imagination, even as the murders were occurring. The suspects, endless theories, few answers. Over 200 suspects have been proposed in the Jack the Ripper case throughout the years, ranging from plausible to utterly fantastical. Victorian police focused their attention on several primary suspects during the original investigation, none of whom could be conclusively linked to the crimes. As decades passed, amateur sleuths and professional researchers alike would add countless names to this list, often based on flimsy evidence or wild speculation. One early suspect was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who committed suicide shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. His family suspected he might be the killer, and this private suspicion eventually reached police ears. While the timing of his death is intriguing, no concrete evidence connects him to the crimes, and his supposed medical knowledge appears to have been exaggerated by later theorists. Another frequently mentioned suspect is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who was institutionalized for mental illness. Contemporary police files indicate he was seriously considered by some investigators, but again, no definitive proof linked him to the murders. The suggestion that he was identified by an eyewitness but not prosecuted because the witness refused to testify against a fellow Jew remains unverified. The royal conspiracy theories represent some of the most elaborate and unlikely suspect scenarios. These suggest the killer was either Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, or someone acting to cover up his alleged secret marriage. The theory posits that high-level government interference protected the real murderer. While this makes for dramatic storytelling, historians have found no credible evidence to support such claims, which appear to have originated decades after the murders. More plausible suspects include several doctors or medical students known to frequent Whitechapel. The killer's apparent anatomical knowledge supports this line of thinking. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with misogynistic tendencies, was investigated by police but fled England before being thoroughly questioned. Similarly, George Chapman, born Severin Klosowski, was a Polish barber surgeon who later poisoned 3 wives in London. While his methods differed from the Rippers, his medical background and violent nature make him an interesting candidate. Modern profiling suggests the killer was likely a local resident familiar with Whitechapel's geography, possibly someone who blended into the working-class environment. He may have had some medical training through military service or apprenticeship rather than formal education. The abrupt end to the killings could indicate his death, imprisonment on unrelated charges, or institutionalization, though some researchers argue the canonical 5 victims may not represent his complete tally. The suspect list continues to grow even today, with recent years seeing names like Charles Lechmere, a Carman who found 1 victim's body, and Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's lover, proposed as potential killers. DNA evidence recovered from a shawl allegedly connected to Catherine Eddowes has been used to suggest Aaron Kosminski's guilt, but this evidence remains controversial among researchers. What becomes clear when examining Ripper suspects is how little concrete evidence exists against any of them. Most theories rely on circumstantial connections or subjective interpretations of historical documents. The passage of time has only muddied the waters, allowing for increasingly speculative accusations against historical figures who can no longer defend themselves. This lack of resolution ensures the suspect debate will continue indefinitely, with each generation proposing new candidates while reevaluating old ones. Cultural impact: how the Ripper changed society. The Jack the Ripper case marked a turning point in how society viewed violent crime, media coverage of murders, and urban poverty. The extensive newspaper reporting created one of the first true crime media frenzies, establishing patterns still seen in modern coverage of serial killers. The graphic details published in Victorian papers, while shocking by today's standards, revealed a public appetite for sensational crime stories that would only grow stronger in the following century. Whitechapel itself became forever associated with the murders, its name synonymous with danger and mystery. The district's poverty and overcrowding, briefly thrust into the spotlight, became subjects of social reform debates. While conditions gradually improved in subsequent decades, the area carried the stigma of the Ripper crimes for generations. Ironically, the notoriety eventually transformed parts of Whitechapel into tourist attractions, with guided walks and museum exhibits capitalizing on the bloody history. The case influenced police procedure and forensic science development. The investigative failures highlighted the need for better coordination between police divisions, more systematic evidence collection, and improved autopsy documentation. While fingerprinting wouldn't become standard practice until the early 1900s, the Ripper investigation demonstrated the limitations of relying on eyewitness accounts and confessions without physical evidence. Literature and popular culture quickly adopted the Ripper mythology. Early fictionalized accounts appeared in penny dreadfuls and stage plays within years of the murders. As cinema developed, numerous films used the Ripper premise, from Hitchcock's 1927 The Lodger to more graphic modern interpretations. The mysterious killer archetype, intelligent, elusive, and taunting authorities, owes much to the Ripper legend, influencing characters from Sherlock Holmes villains to contemporary horror antagonists. The murders also impacted women's lives in Victorian England. While the victims were marginalized individuals, the brutality of their deaths sparked discussions about women's safety and economic vulnerability. Some historians argue the case indirectly supported arguments for better social services and protections for poor women, though meaningful reforms would take decades to materialize. Academic interest in the case has produced an entire field of Ripperology, with researchers publishing thousands of books and articles examining every conceivable aspect of the crimes. Conferences and journals dedicated to Ripper studies continue to thrive, demonstrating the enduring fascination with this unsolved mystery. Modern forensic experts have applied DNA analysis, geographic profiling, and psychological assessment techniques to the old evidence, though no breakthrough has definitively solved the case. The tourism industry surrounding Ripper sites presents an ethical dilemma. While the murders occurred over 130 years ago, some question the appropriateness of commercializing real human tragedy. Walking tours pass by locations where women suffered horrific deaths, often with theatrical retellings that prioritize entertainment over historical accuracy or respect for the victims. This tension between memorialization and exploitation continues to spark debate among historians and community members. Perhaps the most significant cultural impact has been how the Ripper case shaped our understanding of serial killers. Before these murders, society lacked the framework to comprehend repeated, seemingly motiveless killings. The Ripper investigations helped establish patterns that would later inform criminal psychology and profiling. The very term serial killer owes something to the Victorian public's horrified fascination with this unprecedented type of criminal. Unsolved mysteries, lingering questions. Despite countless investigations over 13 decades, fundamental questions about the Jack the Ripper case remain unanswered. The most obvious, the killer's identity, may never be conclusively determined due to the passage of time and loss of original evidence. However, numerous other mysteries continue to puzzle researchers and fuel debate among Ripperologists. One persistent question involves the exact number of victims. Police originally investigated 11 murders in Whitechapel between 1888 to 1891, but only 5 Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly are universally accepted as Ripper killings. Some researchers argue for including earlier or later murders that show similarities in method or victimology. The canonical 5 designation itself is somewhat arbitrary, based on a police official's later memorandum rather than contemporary investigative consensus. The killer's medical knowledge remains another point of contention. While some wounds suggest anatomical familiarity, other aspects appear crude or inconsistent. This has led to theories ranging from the murderer being a trained surgeon to someone with butchering experience or even self-taught anatomical knowledge from medical textbooks. The varying precision between victims also raises questions about whether the killer's skill improved with practice or if some mutilations were performed in haste. Geographic profiling reveals interesting patterns about the murder locations. All occurred within a compact area easily navigable on foot, suggesting the killer lived or worked nearby. However, the choice of specific sites, some relatively exposed, others more secluded, doesn't follow an obvious logic. Researchers debate whether these locations held personal significance for the killer or were simply convenient opportunities. The abrupt end to the murders presents another enigma. After Mary Jane Kelly's exceptionally brutal killing in November 1888, the recognized Ripper-style attacks ceased. Possible explanations include the killer's death, imprisonment for other offenses, institutionalization, or relocation. Some theorists suggest he may have continued killing elsewhere under different methods, though no compelling evidence supports this. Modern analysis has questioned whether all 5 canonical murders were committed by the same hand. Elizabeth Stride's less severe injuries have led some to propose she was killed by a different assailant, making the September 30th double event potentially unrelated crimes. Others point to differences in methodology between victims as suggesting multiple killers copying each other's work. The police files, while extensive, contain frustrating gaps. Important documents were lost over time or damaged in World War II bombings. Some investigators' private notes suggest they had strong suspicions about certain individuals, but left these out of official reports. The reasons for these omissions, whether protecting influential figures or simply avoiding libel, remain speculative. Forensic re-examinations in recent decades have produced more questions than answers. DNA testing on surviving evidence has yielded inconclusive or contested results. The famous Ripper Diary, purportedly written by suspect James Maybrick, was declared a hoax by most experts, demonstrating how modern technology can sometimes complicate rather than clarify historical mysteries. Perhaps the most profound unanswered question is why this particular case continues to captivate when other unsolved murders have faded from memory. The combination of Victorian atmosphere, gruesome details, media sensationalism, and complete lack of resolution creates a perfect storm of enduring fascination. As each generation applies its newest investigative techniques to the old evidence, The Ripper mystery evolves while remaining essentially unsolvable, a historical puzzle that continues to resist final answers. Conclusion: the enduring shadow of Whitechapel. Break time equals 2s/. The Jack the Ripper case represents more than just a series of unsolved murders. It embodies the perfect historical mystery, combining gruesome crime, investigative failure, media sensationalism, and enduring fascination. Break time equals 2s/. Over a century after the last killing, the case continues to generate books, documentaries, scholarly papers, and tourist attractions, demonstrating an unparalleled cultural longevity. Break time equals 3s/. What makes these crimes so persistently intriguing is their resistance to resolution. Break time equals 2s/. In an age where forensic science can solve decades-old cold cases, the Ripper murders remain stubbornly opaque. Break time equals 2s/. The lack of definitive answers creates a vacuum filled by endless speculation, allowing each generation to reinterpret the evidence through contemporary lenses. Break time equals 2s/. The case serves as a Rorschach test of sorts, revealing more about the theorist's times and preoccupations than about Victorian London. Break time equals 3s/. The victims themselves often become overshadowed by the mythology surrounding their killer. Break time equals 2s/. Mary and Nichols. Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were real women with complex lives, not merely props in a sensational drama. Break time equals 2s/. Modern retellings increasingly attempt to restore their humanity, focusing on the societal conditions that made them vulnerable rather than just the brutality of their deaths. Break time equals 3s/. From a criminological perspective, the case marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached serial murders. Break time equals 2s/. The investigative failures spurred reforms in police communication, evidence preservation, and forensic documentation. Break time equals 2s/. While these changes came too late to catch the Ripper, they established protocols that would help solve future cases. Break time equals 2s/. The murders also demonstrated the dangers of media interference in criminal investigations, a lesson still relevant today. Break time equals 3s/. The ethical dimensions of Ripper tourism and commercialization continue to provoke discussion. Break time equals 2s/. While the murders occurred long enough ago to fall into historical study rather than living memory, questions remain about appropriate ways to memorialize such events. Break time equals 2s/. The growing emphasis on victim-centered narratives suggests a gradual shift toward more respectful commemoration. Break time equals 3s/. Technological advances offer slim hope for new breakthroughs, though each purported solution so far has failed to gain universal acceptance. Break time equals 2s/. Even if conclusive DNA evidence someday identifies a suspect, the circumstantial nature of such proof may never satisfy all researchers. Break time equals 2s/. The Ripper's true identity may ultimately matter less than what the case reveals about society's enduring fascination with the macabre and unexplained. Break time equals 3s/. As long as people remain captivated by true crime and historical puzzles, Jack the Ripper will maintain his place as the ultimate bogeyman, a shadowy figure representing our deepest fears about random violence and the limits of justice. Break time equals 2s/. The foggy streets of 1888 Whitechapel continue to obscure the truth, ensuring that history's most infamous serial killer will keep his secrets indefinitely. Break time equals 3s/. The case's true legacy may be how it demonstrates the power of unsolved mystery to capture human imagination across generations. Break time equals 2s/. In our information-saturated age, where answers are usually just a search engine query away, the Ripper murders remain tantalizingly opaque, a reminder that some historical truths may be permanently lost to time, no matter how advanced our investigative methods become. We now occupy the central place in the picture of crime in England at the end of the 19th century. Break time equals 2s/. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 did not occur in isolation, but rather emerged from the complex social fabric of late Victorian England, where crime was as much a part of daily life as the ever-present coal smoke that blanketed London's streets. The break time equals 2s/. To understand the environment that allowed such brutal crimes to go unsolved, one must examine the broader landscape of law enforcement, urban poverty, and societal attitudes that characterize this pivotal period in British history. The break time equals 2s/. The relationship between crime and society during these years reveals much about the challenges facing a nation undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization, where traditional methods of maintaining order struggled to keep pace with the changing times. Break time equals 3s/. Policing in London during the late 19th century represented an uneasy balance between modern reform and outdated practices. Break time equals 2s/. The Metropolitan Police Force, established in 1829, had brought some measure of organization to law enforcement, yet remained woefully understaffed for a city that had grown to contain over 5 million inhabitants by the 1880s. Break time equals 2s/. Constables walked their beats in distinctive uniforms designed to make them easily visible as symbols of authority, but their presence could hardly cover every alley and courtyard of the sprawling metropolis. Break time equals 2s/. The separate City of London Police maintained jurisdiction over the historic Square Mile at London's heart, creating occasional tensions and confusion between the two forces that would later hamper the Ripper investigation. Break time equals 2s/. Most officers came from working-class backgrounds themselves, with limited education and training that focused more on maintaining public order than solving complex crimes. Break time equals 3s/. The daily reality of police work involved dealing with drunkenness, petty theft, and domestic disturbances far more often than confronting dangerous criminals. Break time equals 2s/. Officers carried only a wooden truncheon for protection, with firearms being strictly reserved for special circumstances. Break time equals 2s/. This lack of weaponry reflected both the general peacefulness of most police interactions and the Victorian ideal of policing by consent rather than force. Break time equals 2s/. However, it also left constables vulnerable when facing truly violent offenders. Break time equals 2s/. The absence of any formal detective training for most of the century meant that investigative techniques remained rudimentary, relying heavily on local knowledge and informants rather than systematic evidence collection. Break time equals 2s/. Only in 1878 did the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, form within the Metropolitan Police, creating a small corps of plainclothes detectives who would later work on the Ripper case. Break time equals 3s/. Crime statistics from the period, while incomplete by modern standards, reveal patterns that help contextualize the Whitechapel murders. Break time equals 2s/. Property offenses accounted for the vast majority of recorded crimes, with theft of various sorts being overwhelmingly common. Break time equals 2s/. Violent crimes made up a much smaller portion of overall offenses, though they naturally received disproportionate attention in the press. Break time equals 2s/. Murder remained relatively rare in statistical terms, with London recording between 20 to 50 homicides annually during the 1880s, a rate that would seem astonishingly low by modern urban standards. Break time equals 2s/. What made the Ripper killings so shocking was not just their brutality, but their violation of the generally held belief that murder was typically a domestic affair, committed between people who knew each other, not a random predator stalking strangers in the night. Break time equals 3s/. The court system of Victorian England moved with a ponderous solemnity that often failed to match the realities of urban crime. Break time equals 2s/. Magistrates handled minor offenses with swift efficiency, while more serious cases progressed through a series of increasingly formal proceedings. Break time equals 2s/. The introduction of the Penal Servitude Act in 1853 had reduced the number of offenses punishable by death, though capital punishment remained for murder until 1861. Break time equals 2s/. Transportation to Australia had once served as an alternative to execution, but this practice ended in 1868, leaving imprisonment as the primary punishment for serious crimes. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The prison system itself underwent reforms during this period, moving away from the purely punitive models of earlier decades toward systems emphasizing discipline and hard labor. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Notable figures like Elizabeth Fry had campaigned for improved prison conditions, though facilities remained grim by any modern standard. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The economic underpinnings of crime in Victorian England cannot be overstated. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth for some, while leaving many others in precarious circumstances. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Periodic economic downturns, like the Long Depression beginning in 1873, pushed more people into poverty and desperation. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Unemployment fluctuated wildly in industrial areas, and the absence of any social safety net meant that losing one's job could quickly lead to destitution. Break time equals 2s forward slash. For many, petty crime became not a choice but a necessity for survival. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Children as young as 5 or 6 might be sent out to beg or steal to contribute to family income, beginning patterns of criminal behavior that often continued into adulthood. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The workhouse system, intended as a last resort for the destitute, was so feared that many preferred the risks of crime to submitting to its harsh regime. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The physical environment of London itself facilitated certain types of criminal activity. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The rapid growth of the city had outpaced urban planning, resulting in a maze of narrow streets, blind alleys, and interconnected courtyards that provided both homes for the poor and hiding places for criminals. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Sanitation remained primitive in many areas, with open sewers and shared privies still common in poorer districts. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Lighting varied greatly by neighborhood. Wealthy areas might have gas lamps at regular intervals, while poorer sections relied on sporadic lighting or moonlight. Break time equals 2s forward slash. This patchwork of illumination created shadows where all manner of illicit activities could flourish unseen. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The famous London fog, a combination of natural weather patterns and industrial pollution, further obscured movement and identity during much of the year. Break time equals 3s forward slash. Public attitudes toward crime were shaped by both personal experience and increasingly sensational newspaper reporting. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The expansion of literacy and the reduction of newspaper taxes had created a booming popular press that fed the public's appetite for crime stories. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Penny papers like the Illustrated Police News provided lurid accounts of criminal cases accompanied by dramatic woodcut illustrations. Break time equals 2s forward slash. This coverage tended to exaggerate both the frequency and danger of violent crime, creating moral panics that often had little basis in statistical reality. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The middle and upper classes viewed crime as primarily a problem of the lower orders, failing to recognize how their own business practices and political decisions contributed to the conditions that fostered criminal behavior. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The professional criminal class occupied an ambiguous position in Victorian society. Break time equals 2s forward slash. While burglars and thieves were universally condemned, some figures like the burglar Charles Peace achieved a strange sort of celebrity status. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Fences operated openly in certain districts, knowingly purchasing stolen goods for resale. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Organized criminal networks existed, though they were less sophisticated than their modern counterparts. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The most successful criminals often maintained respectable fronts, moving between the underworld and legitimate society with ease. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Corruption among certain police officers and public officials provided further avenues for criminal enterprise to flourish, though outright institutional corruption was less common than individual officers turning a blind eye for personal gain. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The relationship between crime and social reform in Victorian England was complex and often contradictory. Break time equals 2s forward slash. On one hand, Reformers pointed to criminal statistics as evidence of the need for improved housing, education, and working conditions. Break time equals 2s forward slash. On the other, hardline attitudes emphasizing punishment over prevention dominated much of the political discourse. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Philanthropic organizations established ragged schools and missions to uplift the poor, while simultaneously many in positions of power believed that poverty and crime resulted from moral failings rather than systemic issues. Break time equals 2s forward slash. This tension between reform and repression characterized much of the period's approach to social problems, with neither side achieving clear dominance. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The role of alcohol in Victorian crime cannot be ignored. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Public drunkenness accounted for a significant portion of police arrests, and many violent crimes occurred under the influence of alcohol. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Gin palaces and public houses proliferated in working-class districts, offering temporary escape from grim living conditions. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Temperance movements gained momentum throughout the century, arguing that alcohol was both a cause and consequence of poverty and crime. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Licensing laws attempted to control the worst excesses of public drinking, but enforcement was inconsistent, and illegal drinking establishments flourished in areas where police presence was light. Break time equals 3s forward slash. Gender played a significant role in both the perpetration and experience of crime during this period. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Most recorded offenders were male, though women certainly participated in criminal activities, particularly theft, prostitution, and receiving stolen goods. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The legal system often treated female offenders more leniently than their male counterparts, except in cases involving moral transgressions that violated Victorian ideals of proper womanhood. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Women also frequently found themselves victims of crime, both in domestic settings and public spaces. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The vulnerability of poor women, in particular, was extreme, with few legal protections against exploitation or violence. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The technological limitations of Victorian crime investigation become painfully apparent when examining cases like the Ripper murders. The break time equals 2s forward slash. Without fingerprinting, forensic analysis, or even reliable means of recording crime scene details, detectives relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, notoriously unreliable under the best circumstances. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The preservation of evidence was haphazard at best, with no standardized procedures for handling or storing potential clues. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Communication between police districts was slow and inefficient, relying on physical messengers rather than any sort of instant communication. Break time equals 2s forward slash. These limitations meant that even determined investigators often found themselves stymied by the basic logistical challenges of coordinating information across a large, crowded city. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The legacy of Victorian crime and punishment continues to influence modern systems in ways both obvious and subtle. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Many contemporary police procedures trace their origins to reforms implemented in response to 19th century challenges. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The tension between punitive and rehabilitative approaches to criminal justice remains unresolved. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Urban poverty, while less extreme than in Victorian times, still correlates strongly with criminal activity. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Perhaps most significantly, the sensationalization of crime in media has only intensified since the days of penny dreadfuls and illustrated police news, shaping public perceptions in ways that often distort statistical realities. Break time equals 3s forward slash. When considering the Whitechapel murders within this broader context, they emerge not as an inexplicable anomaly, but as the most extreme manifestation of systemic issues plaguing Victorian society. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The killer's ability to evade capture speaks as much to the limitations of contemporary policing as to his own cunning. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The the vulnerability of his victims reflects the precarious position of poor women in the social hierarchy. Break time equals 2s/. The media frenzy surrounding the case previewed modern true crime obsessions. Break time equals 2s/. And the enduring mystery of the killer's identity continues to fascinate precisely because it represents the ultimate cold case. One where the passage of time has only deepened rather than resolved the questions surrounding those terrible autumn nights in 1888. In ancient Egypt, people lived in a land that was warm and dry most of the time. The sun rose high in the sky every morning, casting long shadows across the sandy landscape. Birds sang their songs as they flew from tree to tree, and animals moved quietly through the fields. People woke up early, stretching their arms and yawning before stepping outside or staying inside to begin their day. Each morning, people started their routine with one simple task: washing themselves. This was not just a habit, it was a way of life. They believed that being clean made them more pleasing to their gods. It also helped them stay healthy and strong. So they spent time each day making sure their bodies were washed and their clothes were clean. It was not something they rushed through. It was part of life, like eating or sleeping. Rich families had servants who helped bring water and prepare things for washing. Poorer families did everything themselves. But no matter how much money they had, everyone tried to be clean. Children learned from their parents how to wash properly. They watched as their mothers and fathers poured water over their hands and rubbed their faces. They copied what they saw and soon made it part of their own routine. Soap was not known in the way we know it today. Instead, people used mixtures of ash and oil or sand and water to scrub away dirt. These simple tools worked well enough for their needs. Over time, these habits became normal. No one needed to be told to wash their hands before eating. Everyone just knew it was the right thing to do. Being dirty was not liked in ancient Egypt. It was seen as disrespectful, especially when visiting temples or meeting important people. Even workers who built large buildings or farmed the fields tried to keep themselves clean when they could. They would rinse their mouths with water after eating and wipe their arms and legs with wet cloths during breaks. The Nile River was very important for cleaning. It provided fresh water for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Many people went to the river in the early morning to wash themselves before starting the day. Children played in the shallow parts while adults cleaned their bodies. It was a time for families to be together and take care of themselves. Being clean was not only about looks, it was also about health. People who washed often stayed healthier than those who did not. Their skin stayed smoother, their clothes smelled better, and they smiled more because they felt better. Over time, these habits became part of Egyptian culture. People passed them down from parent to child. Each new generation grew up knowing that being clean was important. It was not just something you did once in a while. It was something you did every day. So even though life was busy in ancient Egypt, people still found time to take care of themselves. They woke up early, washed their faces, dried off with cloth, and started the day feeling fresh. That is why personal hygiene was such a big part of their lives. People also talked about cleanliness in stories and songs. They told children that the gods loved those who were clean. They sang about the coolness of water and the joy of fresh clothes. These ideas stayed with people for their whole lives. Some people believed that being clean made their prayers stronger. If you went to a temple with dirty hands, the gods might not listen. So people made sure to wash carefully before going to worship. Priests were especially careful. They washed many times each day and never touched anything without first cleaning their hands. Cleanliness was also a sign of respect. When someone visited another home, they were expected to wash before entering. A guest who came in with dirty feet or unwashed hands was not welcome. Hosts always offered water so visitors could clean themselves before sitting down. Even animals were washed sometimes. Farmers rinsed donkeys and oxen after long days of work. Horses were cleaned before special events. Dogs were wiped with wet cloths when they got too dusty. Clean animals looked better and smelled better. Water was carried in jars or pots. These were heavy and took time to fill, but people did not complain. They knew water was important. They shared it with neighbors and made sure everyone had some. Children were taught to carry water at a young age. They helped their mothers and fathers bring it from the river. They learned how to pour it gently and how to store it safely. Carrying water was hard work, but it was also fun. It gave children a chance to spend time outside and help their families. Older people also washed regularly. Even if they could not go to the river, they used whatever water they had. They splashed their faces, wiped their arms, and changed their clothes when possible. Being old did not mean being dirty. People also washed after certain activities. After working in the fields, they rinsed their hands and arms. After walking a long way, they washed their feet. After eating, they rinsed their mouths with water. These small acts kept them clean throughout the day. Mothers made sure their children were clean before sending them out to play or helping with chores. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. These morning habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So every morning, no matter how rich or poor someone was, they started the day the same way. They washed their face, dried off, put on clean clothes, and ate breakfast. It was simple, quiet, and peaceful, and it set the tone for the whole day ahead. Cleanliness was not just about looking good. It was about feeling good. People who were clean slept better, smiled more, and talked kindly to others. They felt ready for whatever the day might bring. In short, daily hygiene was a big part of life in ancient Egypt. People did not need books or signs to remind them. They just knew it was important. From the moment they woke up until the time they went to sleep, they tried to stay clean in body and mind. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose, the birds sang, the water flowed, and people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. In ancient Egypt, each morning began the same way. The sun rose slowly over the horizon. Birds sang quietly in the trees. Animals stirred in their pens or wandered through the fields. People opened their eyes and stretched their arms. They sat up slowly and looked around. The house was still quiet for a moment. Then, one by one, they stood up and began their day. Before doing anything else, people washed their hands and face. This was the first thing they did every morning. Some used water from a small bowl. Others had basins made of stone or clay. Water was poured gently into their hands. They rubbed their face and arms. Then they dried off with cloth. The cloth was soft and warm from the sun, felt nice against their skin. Some people added oil to their skin after washing. This oil came from plants like olives or sesame seeds. It helped protect the skin from the dry air. Women sometimes used a paste made from crushed flowers or herbs. It smelled nice and kept their skin smooth. Men also cared for their skin. They rubbed oil on their faces after shaving. Shaving was common, especially among men who worked in temples or palaces. Children watched their parents and copied them. They poured water into bowls. They splashed it onto their faces. They dried off with cloth. Parents taught them to wash before eating and after waking up. It was a rule in many homes, even if it wasn't written down. It was just understood that you should be clean before touching food. Fresh clothes were important. After washing, people put on clean linen garments. Most clothing was white because it showed dirt easily and reminded people when it needed washing again. Clothes were folded neatly and stored in baskets or boxes. Some people burned incense to make their home smell nice. Others used flowers or oils to make themselves smell better. Bad smells were not liked. People believed that bad smells could bring bad luck or make people sick. Smelling good was part of being clean. People used oils and perfumes to feel fresh. These oils came from plants and sometimes had sweet smells. People liked to feel smooth and clean after a morning routine. It gave them confidence and made them feel ready for the day ahead. Breakfast was simple: bread, dates, onions, maybe some fish or fruit. Before eating, people always washed their hands again. This was done without thinking. Everyone knew to do it. No one needed to be reminded. Being clean was not only about looking good. It was also about staying healthy. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the land also followed morning routines. They might not have had time to bathe, but they still washed their faces and hands before starting work. Some carried small pots of oil to rub on their skin during the day. This kept them cool and protected from the sun. Mothers made sure their children were clean before sending them out to play or helping with chores. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So every morning, no matter how rich or poor someone was, they started the day the same way. They washed their face, dried off, put on clean clothes, and ate breakfast. It was simple, quiet, and peaceful, and it set the tone for the whole day ahead. Being clean was not just about looks. It was about feeling good. People who were clean slept better, smiled more, and talked kindly to others. They felt ready for whatever the day might bring. Morning routines were not only about looking clean, they were also about feeling good. People who started their day fresh and clean felt happier and more ready to work. They smiled more and talked to others with kindness. Even poor families tried to follow these routines. They might not have had fancy basins or expensive oils, but they still washed their faces and hands. They used whatever tools they had, bowls, jars, or even leaves to wipe themselves. Cleanliness was not about having the best things. It was about taking care of yourself every day. Rich families had servants who helped bring water and prepare things for washing. Poorer families did everything themselves. But no matter how much money they had, everyone tried to be clean. Children learned from their parents how to wash properly. They watched as their mothers and fathers poured water over their hands and rubbed their faces. They copied what they saw and soon made it part of their own routine. People believed that being clean made them more pleasing to their gods. They also thought it helped them stay healthy and strong. So they spent time each day making sure their bodies were washed and their clothes were clean. It was not something they rushed through. It was part of life, like eating or sleeping. Water was carried in jars or pots. These were heavy and took time to fill, but people did not complain. They knew water was important. They shared it with neighbors and made sure everyone had some. Older people also washed regularly. Even if they could not go to the river, they used whatever water they had. They splashed their faces, wiped their arms, and changed their clothes when possible. Being old did not mean being dirty. People also washed after certain activities. After working in the fields, they rinsed their hands and arms. After walking a long way, they washed their feet. After eating, they rinsed their mouths with water. These small acts kept them clean throughout the day. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose. The birds sang. The water flowed. And people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people used water to keep their bodies clean. Water was important for many things. It was used for drinking, cooking, and washing. People believed that being clean was good for the body and the soul, so they made sure to use water every day. Bathing was not done every day by everyone. For many people, it was a weekly thing. Rich families had rooms in their homes where they could bathe. These rooms had large basins made of stone or clay. Water was poured into them from jars or buckets. Sometimes servants carried the water from the river or a well. The water was warm if possible. Cold baths were not very popular. People liked to feel comfortable. When they bathed, they sat in the basin and used their hands to splash water over their bodies. Some used a piece of cloth to rub their skin. Sand or ash was sometimes mixed with oil to scrub away dirt. This was like an early form of soap. Poorer people did not have basins in their homes. They used large jars or buckets instead. Or they went to the river. The Nile was full of water and easy to reach. Many people bathed there in the mornings before starting their day. Children loved to play in the water while their parents washed. They splashed around and swam in the shallow parts. Bathing was often a family event. Everyone took turns, and sometimes neighbors shared water. One person would carry it while another poured it. Bathing was not only about cleaning, it was also relaxing. People enjoyed the feeling of clean skin. It made them feel lighter and cooler in the hot weather. After bathing, they dried off with cloth. Then they put on fresh clothes. Oils were applied to the skin to keep it soft. These oils came from plants and sometimes had nice smells. People liked to feel smooth and clean after a bath. It gave them confidence and made them feel good. Bathing was also done before special events. Weddings, festivals, or visits to temples required a full body wash. It showed respect. People wanted to look their best when going to important places or meeting important people. Being clean was a sign of honor and care. Water was precious in ancient Egypt. It was not wasted. Every drop was used carefully. Jars were reused to pour water over the body. Leftover water was used for cleaning the house or watering plants. Nothing was thrown away unless it had to be. Everyone knew how hard it was to get water, especially during dry seasons. Rich families had special places for storing water. They had large jars buried in the ground to keep it cool. Some had shaded areas near their homes where they could wash in peace. Servants helped bring water and prepare for baths. They also helped clean up afterward. Poorer families had to collect water themselves. They walked to the river or well and filled their jars. It was heavy work, but they did it without complaint. They knew water was important for life and cleanliness. They made sure to share with neighbors and help each other when needed. Bathing was not only for people. Animals were also washed when they got dirty. Horses, donkeys, and even dogs were rinsed with water. Farmers used leftover bathwater to clean their tools or give to thirsty animals. Nothing was wasted. People also used water to clean their homes. Floors were wiped with wet cloths. Curtains were soaked and wrung out. Dishes were washed with sand and water. Keeping the home clean was just as important as keeping the body clean. Bathing was not only about removing dirt. It was also about cooling down. In the hot climate of Egypt, people liked to pour water over their heads and shoulders. It helped them feel refreshed and relaxed. Some even slept better after a cool bath. Over time, bathing became part of daily life. People did not need to be told. They just knew to wash when they could. Whether it was a full bath or just a quick rinse, they found ways to stay clean. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the fields also tried to stay clean. They would rinse their mouths with water after eating and wipe their arms and legs with wet cloths during breaks. Being clean was not just something you did at home. It was something you did wherever you were. Older people also bathed regularly. Even if they could not go to the river, they used whatever water they had. They poured it over their heads and rubbed their arms. Cleanliness was not about having a lot of water. It was about using what you had wisely. Mothers made sure their children were clean before sending them out to play or helping with chores. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though people did not bathe every day, they still tried to stay as clean as they could. Water was used wisely. Time was taken to enjoy the process, and everyone left the bath feeling fresh and ready for the day ahead. They poured water gently. They splashed it softly. They washed their arms. They washed their face. They washed their hands. They dried with cloth. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose, the birds sang, the water flowed, and people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people used oils to keep their skin soft. The air was dry and hot most of the time. Skin could become rough and cracked easily. To protect it, people rubbed oil on their arms, legs, and faces. This helped keep their skin smooth and healthy. Oils were made from plants, nuts, and seeds. The most common ones came from olives, sesame, and castor beans. These oils were thick and smelled nice. People applied them after washing their bodies. Felt good on the skin. It also gave them a shiny look in the sunlight. Some oils were mixed with spices or flowers to make them smell better. Perfume was made this way. People liked to smell good. Both men and women used oils and perfumes every day. Rich people had special jars where they kept their oils. These jars were made of stone or clay. Some were decorated with colors and pictures. Poorer people used small pots or cloth bags. They carried them with them. At work, they would stop to rub oil on their skin, cooled them down. It also stopped their skin from drying out. Children were given oils too. Mothers rubbed them on their arms and legs. Babies were covered in oil after their bath. It made them feel warm and safe. Oil was not just for looks. It was also for protection. It helped block the sun and kept dust from sticking to the skin. Perfumes were made from flowers like lotus and jasmine. These were crushed and mixed with oil. The mix was left to sit for days. Then it was ready to use. People put perfume behind their ears, on their necks, and on their wrists. These places stayed warm. The smell lasted longer. During festivals, people wore small cones of scented wax on top of their heads. As the day went on, the wax melted and spread the scent. Temples used smoke from burning herbs to make the air smell good. Priests were always clean and smelled nice. They believed it made the gods happy. Oils and perfumes were not just for looks. They were also used in medicine. Some oils were thought to help with pain or sickness. People rubbed them on sore muscles or cold chests. Over time, the use of oils became part of daily life. It was something people did without thinking. Just like brushing teeth today, oil was a gift from nature. It helped people feel good, smell good, and stay healthy. Rich families had special places to store their oils. They kept them in cool rooms so they would not melt. Some oils were expensive. They were bought from traders who came from far away. Poorer people made their own. They crushed seeds and pressed out the oil by hand. Took time, but it worked well enough. People used oil before going to bed. They rubbed it on their skin and let it soak in during the night. In the morning, they washed it off with water. Their skin felt soft and fresh. Oil was also used during massage. Family members would rub each other's arms and backs. Felt relaxing and helped with tired muscles. Mothers made sure their children used oil every day. They rubbed it on their arms and legs before sending them out to play. Clean children were happy children. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the land also used oil. They rubbed it on their skin to protect against the sun. It helped keep them cool and stopped their skin from cracking. Older people also used oil regularly. Even if they could not buy fancy ones, they used what they had. They rubbed it on their hands and feet. It helped with dryness and made them feel better. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though oils looked simple, they played an important role in daily life. People used them every day. They rubbed them on their skin. They added them to baths. They mixed them with flowers to make perfume. It was all part of staying clean and feeling good. They rubbed oil gently. They smoothed it softly. They smelled sweet. They felt fresh. They smiled quietly. They breathed deeply. They felt calm. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose. The birds sang. The water flowed. And people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They poured oil slowly. They rubbed it softly. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people took care of their teeth. They did not have toothbrushes like we do today. Instead, they used sticks. These were called chew sticks. One end was bitten until it became soft. Then it was rubbed on the teeth. Some sticks came from trees that had a minty taste. This helped freshen breath. People also used their fingers to rub their gums. Salt or ash was sometimes added to make it clean better. Toothpaste did not exist back then, but people made a kind of powder. It was made from crushed eggshells, bones, and salt. They mixed it with water. Then they rubbed it on their teeth. Some people used honey or spices to make it taste better. Brushing teeth was not done every day by everyone, but many did it once a day, usually in the morning or after eating. Teeth were not as white as today, but people tried to keep them clean. Dentists were rare. If someone had a bad tooth, they visited a healer. He might pull it out with his hands or tools made of metal. Pain was common. Teeth were not strong because of the food. Breads had bits of sand in them. This wore down teeth over time. Gums would bleed. Holes would form. Still, people tried to take care of their mouths. Children learned from adults. They watched them use sticks and powders. They copied them. Bad breath was not liked, so people used herbs to make their breath smell better. Mint and parsley were common. Some chewed on them after eating. Others drank tea made from plants. Keeping the mouth clean was part of being clean overall. People did not smile as much as we do now, but they still wanted to feel fresh. They wanted to talk without bad smells. So oral care was part of daily life. It was not fun, but it was needed. Over time, these habits became normal. People did not question them. They just did them, like washing their hands or putting on clean clothes. Rich families had special places where they kept their cleaning tools. Sticks were stored in small boxes. Powders were kept in jars. Poorer families used whatever they had. They found sticks near their homes. They mixed powder with water in small bowls. Mothers made sure their children cleaned their mouths every day. They gave them sticks to chew. They reminded them to rinse after eating. Clean children were happy children. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the land also tried to stay clean. They rinsed their mouths with water after meals. They used sticks when they could. Being clean was not just something you did at home. It was something you did wherever you were. Older people also cleaned their mouths regularly. Even if they had few teeth left, they still used sticks and powders. Cleanliness was not about having perfect teeth. It was about using what you had wisely. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though toothpaste and brushes were not known, people still found ways to care for their teeth. They used sticks. They used powders. They rinsed with water. And they tried to stay fresh all day long. They brushed gently. They rinsed softly. They spat quietly. They wiped their mouths. They smiled slightly. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose. The birds sang. The water flowed. And people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people took care of their hair. They believed that clean hair was a sign of health and respect. Both men and women kept their hair clean and neat. Some wore it long. Others cut it short. Children often had one side shaved and left a single braid on the other. This was a common style for young boys. People washed their hair with water. Some added oil or crushed herbs to make it soft. Combs were made from wood or bone. They were used to untangle hair every morning. Felt nice. It also helped remove dirt and bugs. Lice were common. To stop them, people used oils or crushed herbs. Hats and head wraps were worn to keep hair clean. These were made from cloth. Some were white. Others were dyed with plant colors. Wigs were also used. They were made from human hair or plant fibers. Rich people wore wigs often. They looked neat and did not get dirty. Wigs were cleaned by soaking them in oil. Then they were rinsed in water. After that, they were dried in the sun. People used combs to shape them. Some added perfume to the oil. This made the wig smell nice. Beards were worn by men, especially kings and priests. Fake beards were made from goat hair or wool. They were tied under the chin. Kings wore long, straight beards. Other men had shorter ones. Beards were cleaned with oil and combs. People also shaved their heads and faces. Razors were made from copper. They were not very sharp, but they worked well enough. Shaving was done once a week or more, kept the skin smooth. It also helped prevent bugs. After shaving, oil was rubbed on the face. This soothed the skin. Hair was trimmed with small knives. People did this at home or went to someone who knew how. Cuts were common, but people did not worry much. They cleaned the cut with water and oil. Rich families had special places to store their combs and oils. Poorer families used whatever they had. They found sticks to comb their hair. They made oil from crushed seeds. Mothers made sure their children's hair was clean before sending them out to play. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the fields also tried to stay clean. They wiped their hair with wet cloths during breaks. They used oil to keep it soft. Being clean was not just something you did at home. It was something you did wherever you were. Older people also cared for their hair. Even if they had little left, they still brushed it every day. Cleanliness was not about having thick hair. It was about using what you had wisely. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though tools were simple, people still found ways to care for their hair. They washed it, they combed it, they oiled it, and they kept it neat all day long. They combed gently, they brushed softly, they oiled slowly, they dried carefully, they smiled slightly, they breathed deeply, they felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose, the birds sang, the water flowed, and people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands, they washed their face, they washed their arms, they dried with cloth, they smiled, they breathed deeply, they felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people wore clothes made from linen. Linen was light and easy to clean. Most clothing was white because it showed dirt easily and reminded people when it needed washing again. People believed that clean clothes were a sign of respect and health, so they washed their clothes often. Washing was done by hand. People used water from jars or basins. They rubbed the clothes with sand or ash. Sometimes they stepped on them to get dirt out. After washing, clothes were rinsed in clean water. Then they were hung out in the sun to dry. Sunlight helped make them white again. Clothes were folded and stored in boxes or baskets. Some people used sweet-smelling herbs to keep clothes fresh. Bad smells were not liked. People believed that bad smells could bring bad luck or make people sick, so they tried to avoid them. Fresh clothes made people feel better. They looked nicer, they smelled better, and they smiled more because they felt good. Being clean was not only about looking good. It was also about feeling good. Rich families had servants who helped wash clothes. Poorer families did everything themselves. But no matter how much money they had, everyone tried to wear clean clothes. Children learned from their parents how to care for their clothes. They watched as their mothers and fathers soaked fabric in water and rubbed away dirt. They copied what they saw and soon made it part of their own routine. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the fields also tried to stay clean. They changed their clothes when they could. They wiped their arms and legs with wet cloths during breaks. Being clean was not just something you did at home. It was something you did wherever you were. Mothers made sure their children wore clean clothes before sending them out to play or helping with chores. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. Older people also wore clean clothes. Even if they could not wash every day, they changed when they could. Cleanliness was not about having many clothes. It was about using what you had wisely. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though clothes were simple, people still took care of them. They washed them, they dried them, They folded them neatly, and they wore them with pride. People carried water in jars or pots. These were heavy and took time to fill, but people did not complain. They knew water was important. They shared it with neighbors and made sure everyone had some. Water was not wasted. Leftover water was used for cooking or watering plants. Nothing was thrown away unless it had to be. Everyone knew how hard it was to get water, especially during dry seasons. Clean clothes were worn to temples, festivals, and meetings. Being dirty was not liked in these places. People wanted to look their best. They believed that gods and leaders noticed clean people more than dirty ones. Being clean was not just about looks. It was about respect. When someone visited another home, they were expected to wear clean clothes. A guest who came in with dirty feet or unwashed hands was not welcome. Hosts always offered water so visitors could clean themselves before sitting down. Even animals were washed sometimes. Farmers rinsed donkeys and oxen after long days of work. Horses were cleaned before special events. Dogs were wiped with wet cloths when they got too dusty. Clean animals looked better and smelled better. People also washed after certain activities. After working in the fields, they changed their clothes. After walking a long way, they wiped off dust. After eating, they rinsed their mouths with water. These small acts kept them clean throughout the day. These morning habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So every morning, no matter how rich or poor someone was, they started the day the same way. They washed their face, dried off, put on clean clothes, and ate breakfast. It was simple, quiet, and peaceful, and it set the tone for the whole day ahead. They washed gently, they dried softly, they folded neatly, they wore proudly, they smiled slightly, they breathed deeply, they felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose, the birds sang, the water flowed, and people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands, they washed their face, they washed their arms, they dried with cloth, they smiled, they breathed deeply, they felt clean. In ancient Egypt, people believed that being clean was important. It was not just about looking good. It was also about feeling good. People washed their hands, they washed their face, they washed their arms, they dried with cloth, they smiled, they breathed deeply, they felt clean. Cleanliness was part of daily life. It was something people did without thinking. They woke up early, they poured water gently, they splashed it softly, they rubbed their skin, they dried with cloth, they put on fresh clothes, they ate a simple meal, then they went to work or played with children. Being clean was not only for rich people. Poor families also tried to stay clean. They used whatever tools they had. They washed in jars or buckets. They used leaves to wipe themselves. Cleanliness was not about having the best things. It was about using what you had wisely. Children learned from their parents. They watched them wash every morning. They copied them. They poured water into bowls. They rubbed their faces. They dried off with cloth. Mothers made sure their children were clean before sending them out to play. Clean children were happy children. Workers who built pyramids or farmed the land also tried to stay clean. They rinsed their mouths after eating. They wiped their arms and legs during breaks. They changed clothes when they could. Being clean was not just something you did at home. It was something you did wherever you were. Older people also stayed clean. Even if they could not go to the river, they used whatever water they had. They splashed their faces. They wiped their arms. They changed their clothes when possible. Being old did not mean being dirty. People washed after certain activities. After working in the fields, they rinsed their hands and arms. After walking a long way, they washed their feet. After eating, they rinsed their mouths with water. These small acts kept them clean throughout the day. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose. The birds sang. The water flowed. And people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Water was carried in jars or pots. These were heavy and took time to fill. But people did not complain. They knew water was important. They shared it with neighbors and made sure everyone had some. Leftover water was used for cooking or watering plants. Nothing was thrown away unless it had to be. Everyone knew how hard it was to get water, especially during dry seasons. Clothes were washed often. They were soaked in water. They were rubbed with sand. They were rinsed in clean water. They were dried in the sun. They were folded neatly. They were worn with pride. Rich families had servants who helped bring water and prepare things for washing. Poorer families did everything themselves. But no matter how much money they had, everyone tried to be clean. Children learned from their parents how to wash properly. They watched as their mothers and fathers poured water over their hands and rubbed their faces. They copied what they saw and soon made it part of their own routine. People talked about cleanliness in stories and songs. They told children that the gods loved those who were clean. They sang about the coolness of water and the joy of fresh clothes. These ideas stayed with people for their whole lives. Some people believed that being clean made their prayers stronger. If you went to a temple with dirty hands, the gods might not listen. So people made sure to wash carefully before going to worship. Priests were especially careful. They washed many times each day and never touched anything without first cleaning their hands. Cleanliness was also a sign of respect. When someone visited another home, they were expected to wash before entering. A guest who came in with dirty feet or unwashed hands was not welcome. Hosts always offered water so visitors could clean themselves before sitting down. Even animals were washed sometimes. Farmers rinsed donkeys and oxen after long days of work. Horses were cleaned before special events. Dogs were wiped with wet cloths when they got too dusty. Clean animals looked better and smelled better. Mothers made sure their children were clean before sending them out to play or helping with chores. They wiped their faces, checked their clothes, and made sure their hair was brushed. Clean children were happy children. These habits were passed down through generations. Children watched their parents and learned what to do. Soon, they were doing it on their own without being told. It became a normal part of life. So even though life was busy in ancient Egypt, people still found time to take care of themselves. They woke up early, washed their faces, dried off with cloth, and started the day feeling fresh. That is why personal hygiene was such a big part of their lives. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean. Every morning, the same thing happened again and again. The sun rose, the birds sang, the water flowed, and people, young and old, rich and poor, stood by their basins and bowls and began their day the same way. They washed their hands. They washed their face. They washed their arms. They dried with cloth. They smiled. They breathed deeply. They felt clean.